Greetings, audiences. Welcome to the ASME Dynamic Systems and Control Division podcast series. I'm your host for today, Selina Pan. In our podcast series, we have conversations with researchers, students, journal editors, and all members of the Dynamics and Control community to share their experiences and perspectives. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Scott Moura, who is an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, joining us. Scott went to undergrad at Berkeley, then did his PhD at the University of Michigan, then a postdoc at UC San Diego, and then he came home to Berkeley as faculty. Hi, Scott, welcome.
Hi, Selina, great to be here with you.
Great to have you. Let's start by having you tell me about the latest projects in your lab.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for having me. I first want to say that I am subscribed to the podcast on YouTube, and I'm sure there's other platforms. And when new episodes come out, I try to listen to them immediately. So I definitely encourage everyone out there to, this is the first time I've said this, like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon, if you enjoy it. So to the question, you're asking me about the latest projects in my lab. So first, I'll introduce my lab. It's called the Energy Controls and Applications Lab, or ECAL, at UC Berkeley, and I'll highlight two projects. They're called NextCar and Slurp UV. So I'll start with NextCar. NextCar is a project funded by the US Department of Energy, ARPA-E, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency in Energy. And the idea of NextCar is to leverage autonomy and connectivity to enhance the energy efficiency of vehicles. And in phase one of this project, the goal was to reduce energy consumption by 20%. In phase two, the goal is to up that to 30% and actually increase the autonomy level. And if you're wondering why this matters, one stat I'll share is that if we think about global greenhouse gas emissions, the transportation sector accounts for 12% of it. But for example, where you and I live, Selina, in California, transportation is actually 40% of all of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big chunk and certainly a focus in the US and in California in particular. So on this project, we're partnered with WideSense, which is the name of a startup out of Berkeley, and then also Hyundai Motor Company. And so there are many things going on in this project, but I'll highlight one thing that's unique is the fact that we are trying to reduce energy consumption by leveraging infrastructure to vehicle coordination. So that's different from what a lot of automotive companies might do, who perhaps don't have or don't want to get into the, for example, traffic light infrastructure. So something that we've been able to do, and we've demonstrated actually in Arcadia, a suburb of Los Angeles, is adding some measurement hardware and wireless communication to traffic lights that will broadcast to the vehicle its signal phase and timing. So for everyone out there, think about it as like when you go to a crosswalk, you see the crosswalk sign and there's a countdown timer for how much longer you're able to safely cross. It's like that, but it's a traffic light talking to the car, and there's nothing visual. It's all wirelessly communicated, and then the vehicle automates its speed trajectory to basically try not to slow down or speed up too much. The next project I'll highlight is called Slurp UV. It stands for the Smart Learning Research Pilot for EV Charging. And the goal here is to generate the next generation of public and workplace EV charging via Uber-like pricing. So what does that mean? So I'll explain in a sec, but first I'll highlight that it's sponsored by Total Energies and UC Berkeley's Parking and Transportation. And we've actually built a network of charging stations across California. We have chargers at UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, and an office in San Jose. And what's unique about this is almost all other EV charging pilots optimize the power schedule. We optimize price and power. And that's why I refer to the Uber-like pricing. And that's to reflect the value of electrons as a function of time. And quite honestly, even to reflect the value of atoms, that is where you place the car. When there's congestion, then the charging service spot is more valuable. So we've been doing this for about a year, and we have over 500 sessions of data, 10 megawatt hours of power delivered, about 35,000 electric miles delivered, which is honestly not a lot. Those should not be impressive numbers because we're in COVID and told everybody to stay at home. So they're not going to work and charging. So that's actually increasing dramatically right now as campus opens up. But what's pretty neat is, despite all that, it's a closed loop system in that our control signal is price, but the actuator people is like a stochastic actuator. We can't control what choice they make and how they want to charge their vehicle, but we can incentivize them with a certain price. So in more detail, we have a flexible and a regular charging option. We've already been able to show that we can create a discount for the flexible pricing option and significantly shift the number of users that choose the flexible one over the regular one, which changes their charging, their EV charging session from an uncontrollable load to a controllable one where we can shift the power over time. And we can do that with pricing. And so that's pretty neat. So I'll stop there. 2 projects in my lab.
Yeah, awesome. Both of those projects sound really interesting and really at the forefront. I know that for the first one, I've been amazed at the different levels of pedestrian countdowns that you can see as you go from city to city, and never occurred to me, well, we can actually take advantage of that for vehicles as well, not just humans. And then for the second one, you know, pricing versus timing, given the nature of all the climate disasters that have been going on recently, I think it is really important for us all to start thinking about power as a product, something that is not just there and a natural resource necessarily, and it is a very precious resource that we do have to pay for, and we have to pay attention to it on multiple levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, I've personally been seeing more and more people moving into the environmental and energy space from all sorts of controls jobs. For example, from autonomous vehicles, robotics, et cetera. This could be anything from working on building energy management, batteries, drones monitoring climates above air or underwater. Based on this, do you think this is indicative of any larger movement?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I must say that I've been coincidentally fortunate in that as a graduate student in mechanical engineering, going through a pretty classical controls curriculum, I'm now a professor in civil environmental engineering, and starting to understand all this interaction. So there's no doubt, on your question, is this indicative of a larger movement? There's no doubt that this is a larger movement. And we need everybody, including those out there listening. And actually, I kind of think about this in terms of a push and a pull, right? So there's a push into the energy environmental space because particularly young people today are starting to ask more the question, how do I make the world a better place, as opposed to, you know, how do I make a cooler product? There's I think, more of a social consciousness that exists in our community. And, you know, along with public health and social justice, climate change is one of this generation's top 3 grand challenges in my mind. And, you know, there's fantastic problems in the energy and environmental space with deep and rich scientific challenges, yet at the same time, broad societal impacts. So if one is thinking, how do I shape my future career, or how might I shift careers, it's absolutely a rewarding space to go into, I think, in the eyes of many. And examples of it being rich scientifically with broad impact is, you know, we can talk about controlling a heterogeneous set of distributed energy resources. We could talk about, you know, floating offshore wind turbines, which all of a sudden make that inverted pendulum problem that we learn in controls classes relevant, because that's essentially what it is. Batteries, another area I work in, future batteries need to be cyber enabled with sensors and actuators that actively increase the lifetime and performance instead of them being, passive devices. So that's the push into this space, but there's a pull too. And I think the Dynamic Systems and Control Division is uniquely positioned to contribute based on their training and their perspective. And in my mind, it's not coincidental that as we look around to the leaders in our community, they're taking top leadership positions in government, in industry, and in universities. And I think it really has to do with, I reflect on our training, and really, we need to understand the fundamental physics. We need to understand the dynamic interactions between systems, so that there's that systems level thinking. Computation is an important part of what we do. And so when we think about coupling physical infrastructure, the physical world, with cyber-enabled tools, this is essentially what the division does. So, even if there are folks in our community who may not be explicitly thinking about energy and environment, the problem in the space is pulling them in, because we need that way of thinking.
Yeah, this is quite a sweeping response from you. But I remember when I was picking my own major and thinking about controls and dynamics, it seemed like it was very applicable to a wide number of fields. And so that's kind of why I chose it, because I knew that you could go anywhere. So it's really great to hear that you also believe that, and believe that of our community. All right, so let's rewind a little bit and say you are a student or have a student getting an undergrad degree in engineering, and their goal is to land a job in energy. What advice do you have for them? This could be anything from the types of courses to take, electives, the types of activities and clubs to participate in, even interviews and interview questions that you might be familiar with.
Yeah, so the question is, how do I land a job in energy? Yeah. If a student asked me this question, I think my answer would be, actually, be more ambitious. That is, I want to change the narrative in our minds around, rather than about getting a job in energy, about how do I make an impact in energy? And then the jobs will follow, the opportunities will follow naturally from that. Because, even after you find a job in energy, you will continue to learn and evolve and find different ways to make impacts. So what'll stay consistent throughout is the question of, how can I make that impact? And I think in answering that question about how can I make an impact in energy, so I'm going to reframe it, is to really find your passion. So for an undergraduate, for example, I would advise, and quite honestly, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't have this knowledge. So I was really just kind of evolving randomly through my undergraduate experience. But looking back, I think I would emphasize, take those fundamental classes in physics and thermodynamics and calculus and so forth. But along with it, try to find some experiential activities. So Selina, you mentioned, some electives they could take, or clubs or things like that. So experiential activities, I think, are really those that you were referring to. So, the solar car team, or DOE has a solar decathlon, or maybe it's an internship where you're getting experience in industry and contributing to something specific. But the reason I think it's important to do both together is because you need to be in that electricity and magnetism class and be thinking about some experiential activity and thinking about, Faraday's law, and like, what does this mean in terms of how an electric motor works? Because I need to know this for this, internship, or for this competition team, right? And so if you can have those complementary experiences, I think it really enhances one's ability to learn quickly. And I think I'd focus on, or I tell students, sometimes we're so concerned about having the perfect experience, like what is the optimal set of classes, or what is the optimal experience? And I hope I can encourage students to let go of that idea and not stress about it, because there in fact is none. And even if there was, it'll change, every term in your mind. So really it's more about find something where you think you can learn, and then just experience it as deeply as you can, And a positive outcome could be hating it, right? So I certainly have had internships where I realized pretty quick, this is not for me. And the positive thing that came out of that is I knew exactly where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do now, because I knew what I didn't want to do in terms of making impact. Yeah, so just find opportunities to learn as much and as quickly as possible.
That's such a positive message. I love that phrase, evolving randomly. That's hilarious, but also like such a descriptor of undergrad for many people. So being able to provide this retroactive perspective to your past self, I think will help many students right now. All right, so we talked about undergrad, but how about for master's and PhD students?
Yeah, for master's and PhD, I think it can be the same answer with slight modifications in that once you get to a master's or a PhD degree program, you likely have some experiences under your belt and you have a better idea of what your passions are. And so you can go deeper in terms of learning the fundamental knowledge and getting those experiences. But I think what I want to emphasize at the master's and PhD level is to make an impact in energy, try to gather some leadership experiences. Because when we reflect on the fact that this is one of society's top 3 grand challenges, no one solves it by themselves in a superhero fashion. We really need a team. And particularly for those out there listening, you know, I view them as really today and tomorrow's leaders, which really means how do you inspire and organize like-minded folks, or even not like-minded folks, or, you know, but have similar goals to really pursue these challenges. So anything one can do, you know, mentor in undergrad, take some leadership position in a club, organize workshops, you know, anything that can sort of gather many around a singular purpose. I think that's incredibly important as well, if you want to make an impact in energy.
Yeah, I think both of your answers from both undergrad and for graduate students sort of are centering around this theme of breaking the narrative of the perfect resume and the heroism narrative of trying to save everything yourself and do it all yourself. And I'm so appreciative of the fact that you're trying to open it up beyond that to people who are listening. Yeah, so speaking of the leaders of tomorrow, both universities and companies are realizing more than ever now the importance of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and an inclusive environment. So what are some of the types of actions and initiatives that you've found most effective?
Yeah, we could have a whole episode on diversity, equity, inclusion. We can even add belonging into that. We could have a whole podcast series on this. So yeah, what actions and initiatives have I found most effective? Well, first, you know, particularly in this past year, I've been reflecting on the fact that, and it's established scientifically, that we need as much creativity as possible to solve the world's most urgent problems. So diversity is a question of quality and impact. Ultimately, if that's our objective, that needs to be our tool. But the inclusion part, I think, reflects that often we don't even have the right stakeholders at the table to solve some of these problems, you know, who are most impacted by it, right? So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think we also need to be aware of who suffers from these problems, who we're trying to solve, and do they have a seat at the table, some power, some authority, some voice to be able to share what they see, what they feel, and what are solutions that work, right? And so this is, of course, going to be an evolution to sort of have this persist systemically within our society. But I'll reflect on, you know, recently I served on a faculty search at UC Berkeley that was themed on climate equity and environmental justice, right? Which is, you know, climate equity, environmental justice, something that one might not think is core in engineering in a classical sense. But I'll share a few things that were really enlightening to me in searching for new professors. So first, in terms of inclusion, students are a stakeholder in bringing new professors to the university. So something we did actually for the first time in our department, at least in this form, was have PhD students be full members of the search committee. So their vote and their voice equaled a tenured faculty member. And the thing that I didn't quite expect that came out of that is that the students, the PhD students, really had honestly, at times, a higher commitment to the process and put in more time and thoughtfulness into evaluating candidates, that when we would meet together, they would bring arguments and points that would really elevate and put pressure on tenured faculty in terms of what did they come with in terms of their preparation and knowledge of a candidate, or some thoughtfulness about what they bring. And that was very interesting to me, right? Is that they immediately increased the quality of discussion just by their sheer quality.
It sounds a little bit like, instead of professors in a boardroom and bringing in a student who sat there quietly, it was more like the professors came into the lab where the students were having debates, and then that was sort of the home environment for this.
Exactly. It certainly bring in the lab and their experiences into the discussion. Some other things that I'll highlight that I think are incredibly important is I've realized that creating rubrics whenever you're doing hiring or admissions is incredibly important to sort of establish what are the attributes that we value. And actually, I've seen that it's not about creating rubrics so that you could have a singular score for people. But what it does is, if you have to fill out a rubric, it forces you to slow down when you're evaluating a candidate and think about every one of the aspects that you all have mutually agreed upon, think are important, so that you're not overwhelmed by a particular attribute like, oh, this person comes from my university and I know them, so I'm just going to wipe away some deficiencies in other areas that we all agreed upon as important. It forces you to slow down and think about those things. And so that type of transparency into the process and including stakeholders, I think has been pretty enlightening to me as some tools in a faculty search. I'll probably stop there, but there's certainly a lot more angles to this that we can discuss.
Yeah, like you said, there could be an entire podcast dedicated to this subject. Thank you for bringing to light some of the adaptations in the most recent faculty search. I think a lot of those lessons can also be applied to industry. For example, bringing in junior employees at the company when deciding on new people to bring into the C-suite, for example. All right, so we're actually on to our final question. I once read a quote unquote letter to my 26-year-old self by Joan Juliet Buck that said, find things that are good for you that are not work, romance, social life, or shopping. She was once the editor of Vogue Paris, which is maybe helps explain this a little more, but it still applies, I think. So since many students and young people who are starting out in their careers are in this sort of age range, what have you found for yourself that are good for you, that aren't work, romance, social life, and shopping?
Selina, I love this question. It's such a great thing to think about. Yeah, for me, there are two things in my life that have not been work, romance, social life, or shopping. And they are soccer and music. So with soccer these days, I play in, actually before COVID, it was two leagues. There was an outdoor soccer league and an indoor futsal league. Now it's just the outdoor league. But what I love about soccer, it's a adult league in the East Bay area, in the San Francisco Bay area. And we play once a week. Actually, last night we had a game. And what I love about it is that, you know, you could have a terrible day with work, you know, or social life, or shopping, I guess. And you just get out there on the field and you play with your team, and it's a way to interact and connect with people, score some goals, win a game, and feel good about yourself, even if you don't have a good day. What's probably more often my experience is, maybe you have a decent day, things are going okay, and then you go out in the soccer field and you kind of get beat up a little bit and whooped and lose a game, and it always keeps your humility, right? So it's a great, I think, activity to kind of even things out and interact with people. And with music, I was very active with this as a graduate student, and not so much these days, but I hope to pick it up, is I studied oboe. And so something I did as a graduate student, and eventually I'm going to pick back up again, is I went to the music school across the street and took oboe lessons from one of the graduate students. And what was great about that is, when I'm stuck with something on code or experiment isn't working right, I just be like, screw this, let's just, go play some music, go practice some songs and take a lesson, and just kind of express and exercise the other part of my brain. I think it's so important for all of us to sort of find things that help us balance spiritually in our own ways and identify those and really buy into it. I've noticed that my happiness level, that's why I love this question from you, Selina, and I'm curious what your answer is to it, of it, how important it is to find these other aspects in life that help balance you.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you described, if you've had a bad day at work, it can lift you up. Or, if you're just flying high at work and everything else and you get beat up on the soccer field, it keeps you humble. So that idea of balance is really important. And I think one of the underlying themes of this question is that these things that you do for yourself, it's sort of win-win, because if you perform well or if you play a great game, it adds to your life. And then if you mess up a note or if you didn't play the best game, the stakes are a little less than losing out on a grant proposal or something like that. So in the end, it's full benefits, I think.
That's a great way to think about it.
I can just give you one example of mine, which is
yeah, tell me.
Over the pandemic, I have gotten really into paint by numbers kits while listening to podcasts, which is kind of why I'm working on this podcast series now. So for me, it also, I think, provides some of that meditative aspect that soccer and music provide for you.
Oh, so you're painting by numbers right now? It doesn't seem like it.
No, I'm not doing it while talking to you. This is way too engaging. But yeah, it serves the same purpose: low stakes and high enjoyment. So
that's really cool.
All right, so I think we've reached the end of our time slot for today, and I hope the audience enjoyed learning a bit more about Scott's life, his lab, his advice, his take on everything going on in the world. It's been great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Selina. Pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. All right, signing out.